Our presenter today is Jennifer Pringle, Director of the New York State Technical and Education Assistance Center for Homeless Students, which is also known by the acronym NYS Teaches. The center is housed at Advocates for Children in New York City and is funded by the New York State Education Department. The center provides information and training to school districts, social service providers, parents, and others on issues related to the education of homeless students. For over 10 years, Ms. Pringle has worked to ensure that students experiencing homelessness have access to educational services and the supports they need to succeed in school. Since 2005, she has served as the director of NYS Teaches. Ms. Pringle is the 2009 recipient of the Distinguished Service and Leadership Award from the National Association for the Education of Homeless Children and Youth. She received her undergraduate degree from Dartmouth College and her law degree from Columbia Law School. So it was with great pleasure I am welcoming Jennifer Pringle. And Jennifer, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I'm excited to bring this presentation to you all today. It's wonderful to be able to reach so many school business officials because of the critical role that you all play in ensuring that kids in temporary housing have access to educational services. I also want to note, too, that as Russell mentioned, we're going to be starting the recording of the webinar, and it will be available for you to view, or if you have other colleagues who missed today, for them to view as well. Okay, Deborah gave a great overview of New York State Teaches, so I'm going to skip through this really quickly. One thing that I do want to point out is that New York State Teaches operates a hotline, and our 800 number is listed here on this slide as well as at the bottom of each of the PowerPoint slides. Please feel free to give us a call if you have any questions about the material presented today, or if you have other homeless education related questions. Also, too, we offer a bunch of information on our website and can send you free posters and brochures and other materials free of charge. Before we get started, I want to launch a very short 4 questions, true-false pretest. All of your answers are anonymous, so if you could take a minute here and answer these questions, and then we'll review them together. Okay, about half of you are done. We'll give it a few more seconds here. Okay, so most of you have completed this, and now I'd like to share some of the answers with you here. So again, all answers are anonymous. So number 1, a student who is homeless must transfer to the district in which the student is temporarily residing. The answer to that is false, and most of you got that one correct. Number 2, the STAC 202 form should be completed and sent to the State Education Department for any student identified as homeless. That's actually false. It should be completed for any student identified as homeless, but only sent to state ed if the district is entitled to additional state aid. And we'll go through that process. Number 3, in most cases, a district can get reimbursed for the cost of instruction for a student in temporary housing if it is not the district of origin. That's true. And then finally, number 4, districts cannot get reimbursed for transporting McKinney-Vento students. And the answer to that is false, and most of you got that one right, which is great. So we're going to go through all of these topics in more detail here throughout the presentation. The first topic that we're going to go through is just a brief overview of McKinney-Vento, and I want to just first share some statistics with you. So on this slide, you can see the rate at which students tested proficient on the math and reading exams during the 11-12 school year. The dark blue bar represents students identified as homeless. The light blue bar represents students identified as coming from low-income families. And then the orange bar represents all students in the state. And as you can see, there's a pretty dramatic difference between these three groups of students. One thing that I think is really telling about this slide is that it shows that kids experiencing homelessness face significant academic barriers that even above those faced by low-income students. And many of those barriers can be traced to the number of school transfers that kids in temporary housing experience. As kids moved from temporary housing location to temporary housing location, they often transfer schools. And there's been a lot of research done showing that with each school transfer, the negative implications, the negative outcomes accumulate. Not only are they more likely to have lower test scores, they're also more likely to repeat a grade, they have higher dropout rates. And there's also a growing body of research showing about the negative social and emotional outcomes associated with these high levels of school transfers. One thing is, I'm sure that I don't need to tell you all as working in school districts, is that one thing that contributes to a child's resiliency, their ability to cope with stressful situations, is having a connection, a stable connection to a caring adult. And oftentimes that caring adult is a teacher, a coach, a guidance counselor in the school. And when kids frequently transfer schools, they not only lose those connections, but they're not able to even develop those new types of connections with caring adults because of that mobility. So with that in mind, the U.S. Congress passed the federal McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. It was first passed in 1987, and it was most recently reauthorized as a part of No Child Left Behind. And you'll see right here on this slide the three key elements. One, the biggest one, is school stability, so ensuring kids in temporary housing can stay in their same school. So even though things may be chaotic at home and they may be moving from place to place, at least the child can stay connected with their same school. If that's not possible, the law also allows for immediate access to the new local school. And then finally, the law has provisions included in it that speak to what types of services should be offered to kids in temporary housing to ensure academic success. I want to briefly go through some examples of temporary housing. This is a list of temporary housing covered by McKinney-Vento included in the law. The most common type of temporary housing is sharing the housing of others due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or other similar reason. This is frequently referred to as doubling up. The second most common type of temporary housing situation is living in emergency or transitional shelters. But as you can see from this list, there are also other types of temporary housing situations that are also covered in the law. In addition, the law also covers those students who lack a nighttime residence that's fixed, regular, and adequate. So fixed going to whether or not the housing is affixed to the ground. So for example, living in a car would not be a fixed nighttime residence. Regular goes to whether or not the student is going back to the same housing on a regular or routine nighttime basis. And then adequate goes to whether or not the housing meets the physical and psychological needs of the student. So for example, if it's overcrowded or if the housing doesn't have heat or hot water or electricity, those are all examples of housing that might be inadequate. So as you can see, McKinney-Vento covers a broad range of temporary housing situations. And for those kids who are covered under McKinney-Vento, Here are 4 of their key rights under this federal law. They can stay in the school of origin and get transportation, immediately enroll in the local school, and get free meals, and they are categorically eligible for Title I services. In addition, every school district must appoint a McKinney-Vento liaison. That liaison is responsible for making sure that kids experiencing homelessness are identified and enrolled in school and connected with the services that they need and for which they are eligible. They're also responsible for making sure information is given to parents of students in temporary housing so that they're aware of what types of educational opportunities are available for their kids in school. They're also responsible for putting up notices about McKinney-Vento and making sure that enrollment disputes are properly mediated. I want to bring you over to our website really quickly. If you ever have a question about who your liaison is in your district or a neighboring district, we have a list of all the liaisons. You can search by name, school district or BOCES, city, town, county, and you will get their name and contact information and email. Okay, so as I said before, McKinney-Vento defines homelessness very broadly. Students in temporary housing have the choice of staying in their same school or transferring to a local school. Students typically do better when they do stay in their same school. So let's talk about the identification and enrollment forms that you may come across in your work. And so we'll do a little poll here. Again, all answers are anonymous. Here's the question: which form should be completed for all students seeking enrollment who are homeless? Okay, most of you have voted. We'll give it 10 more seconds. Okay, and I'll show the results with you there. So almost half of you got this one right. It is C, the residency questionnaire, and STAC 202 form. Those are the 2 forms that should be completed for all students seeking enrollment who are homeless. So whenever a student comes into your district seeking enrollment, they should be given a residency questionnaire. And we'll talk about the residency questionnaire and the STAC 202 form, the two forms involved with identifying students experiencing homelessness. And then we'll go on to talk about the reimbursement forms and procedures. And as you can see on this slide, the STAC 202 form is listed in both categories. So the STAC 202 form serves a dual purpose. Both serves as an identification form, and then also it serves in a subset of cases as a tuition reimbursement form. So here is a screenshot of the model residency questionnaire that was designed by the State Education Department. To the right in your materials pane, you will see a Word document for this that you're free to download. Most districts have either incorporated this form verbatim or have taken out the questions and inserted it into their enrollment packet. This should be given to all students seeking enrollment in the district, as well as those seeking a change of address. The next slide, you'll see the STAC 202 form. This is the official identification form that under state law must be completed for any student identified as homeless. And then in certain circumstances, the STAC 202 form will also be sent to the State Education Department in order for the district to get additional state aid or tuition reimbursement for a student in temporary housing. if that student was last permanently housed in a different New York State district. And we'll go into more detail in a further slide. Okay, so let's look at an example here. So let's say Jessica was first permanently housed in District A. The family was evicted from their housing, temporarily moved in with relatives in District B. Because of the long distance from District A, her parents decided to enroll her in District B. After staying there for a couple months, the relatives said, listen, this is just too overcrowded. You need to find someplace else to live. They applied for emergency housing and were placed in a motel in District C. In this circumstance, Jessica's family hopes to find permanent housing in District C. So they thought it made the most sense for Jessica to enroll in District C. So in completing the STAC 202 form for the district of attendance before becoming homeless, excuse me, that would be District A. That's where the family was living when they were last permanently housed. The district where Jessica was last enrolled would be District B. That's where she was living when enrolled in school when she was living with her relatives. And then finally, the district of current location is District C, where her family is now temporarily housed in a motel. And then the designated district of attendance, in this particular scenario, would then be completed but with District C. So in most cases, you're only going to have 2 districts at play. But in some cases where you have a student who's moved around a bit, you may have up to 3 districts at play on this form. Okay, so here's another poll for you. Who should receive a copy of the STAC form in this particular scenario? Please check off all that apply. So the answer to this is all of these entities should get a copy of the completed STAC form. District A should get a copy because it's the district of origin, and they will see their state aid adjusted downwards. They will receive a deduction because they are the district of origin. You want to let District B know that Jessica has now transferred to a new district, and so you should share a copy of this with them so they know that they should be closing out their own STAC on Jessica. The parent should be given a copy, and Department of Social Services should also be given a copy if it placed the family in temporary housing in your district, as well as the STAC unit, because and you want to make sure the STAC unit gets it because you want to make sure that
Jen, your audio is cutting in and out again.
Is this better?
Yes, I can hear you again.
We'll see if this is better. Okay, sorry about that. And then you also want to make sure that SCD's STAC unit gets a copy of the completed form so that District C can get that additional state aid for instruction. Okay, we strongly recommend that districts have protocols in place that identify who will be responsible for identifying McKinney-Vento students. Is it going to be the liaison, the pupil accounting secretary, the principal, the guidance counselor? Who will be responsible for entering the data into the student management system, because districts are required to record housing status information? Who's going to be responsible for completing and submitting the STAC form to SCD in those cases where the district is eligible for additional state aid? Making sure that the referral gets made to your transportation department, school meals department, and then making sure that that records request gets done. Oftentimes, school district personnel will think that another person is handling some of these key responsibilities, and it can lead to delay in the provision of services. So again, it's important to have clearly articulated roles at the school level to support McKinney-Vento students, and you want to make sure that that residency questionnaire is completed for all students, regardless of their housing status. You don't want to make any assumptions about whether or not you think the student is permanently housed or temporarily housed. And then if, based on the information given in the residency questionnaire, the family indicates they're in temporary housing, you want to make sure that that STAC 202 form is filled out. Okay, so now we are going to jump to state aid, and we're going to delve a little bit deeper into how the process works for state aid for instruction. So if a student transfers schools to the district of current location, so the district in which they're temporarily residing, and they were last permanently housed in a different New York State district, then the district of current location will be eligible for additional state aid for instruction. If the student maintains enrollment in the district of origin, there's no additional state aid. If the student is coming from out of state or out of the country, there is no additional state aid. So again, only applies when you transfer to the district of current location and the student was last permanently housed in a different New York State district. So here's the process for the reimbursement for additional state aid, and we're going to go through each step. You have the STAC 202, the DSHOM screen, the AVL screen, then you have the approved payment report, and finally the general formula aid output report. So after the district completes the STAC 202 form for a student who is last permanently housed in a different New York State district, sends it up to the STAC office at SED. The STAC office will then input the information on the STAC form into the STAC mainframe. After that point, the district is required to submit an approval, and the way that they do this is by logging on to the STAC mainframe, going to the DSHOM screen. The approval must be given every year, so if you have a student who is homeless over multiple years, this screen needs to be filled out for each of those years. However, you only need to submit the STAC form to the STAC unit one time. We've included the STAC office's phone number at the end of this presentation, so if you have questions about this, definitely give them a call. The STAC office has now started to send out homeless eligibility reports. It's a couple times a year to alert districts to students who have open STACs, but for whom an approval has not been submitted. Okay, after the district has checked off the box in the DSHOM screen, then the student will appear on the automated verification list, also referred to as the AVL. At the end of the school year, the superintendent or his or her designee will check off by each student's name, verifying that the information is correct. After the AVL has been completed, then the districts will receive an approved payment report. Districts are reimbursed at whatever the non-resident tuition rate is. Or if the student attends a BOCES or a non-public school, the district will be reimbursed at whatever the state-approved rate is for those programs. It's an electronic transfer of funds that will appear as a part of the district's state aid. Then what the State Education Department does is it then reduces a portion of the District of Origin's state aid, which represents the basic contribution amount prorated for the period of instruction. I'll say that again. what happens is State Education Department says, okay, District of Origin, this kid who used to be yours transferred to the district of current location. We paid the district of current location. Now we're going to reduce your state aid by whatever the per pupil tax levy is, which is also referred to as the basic contribution amount, prorated for the period of instruction. So for example, if the student transferred in January to the new district, to the district of current location, the district of origin will only see a deduction of state aid for January, February, March, April, May, June, for those 6 months. That represents 6 months of the basic contribution amount. There's also a memo on this topic that's included in the materials section that the State Education Department issued in September that outlines the payment process. Also, as a part of this memo, the State Education Department makes clear that while students can remain in their same school for the remainder of the school year in which the student becomes permanently housed, but the district can no longer stack for a student after they become permanently housed. Instead, the district providing instruction can directly bill the new district of residence for the cost of instruction. And again, this was the practice of many districts, but the State Education Department recently put out guidance on it, clarifying that this is the appropriate procedure that districts should follow in these types of cases, because McKinney-Vento allows a student to stay in the same school for the duration of homelessness plus the remainder of the school year in which they become permanently housed. But because you can only stack for the period of homelessness, the State Education Department has now instructed districts for that remainder of the school year, you can now directly bill the new district of residence for the cost of instruction. Okay, now I'm going to talk about transportation aid. So nationally, the cost of transportation is the biggest barrier for students who are homeless. Fortunately, here in New York State, we have state aid for transportation costs, and transportation costs associated with kids in temporary housing are aided the same way as they are for permanently housed kids. In New York State, on average, districts receive reimbursement for about 60% of their costs. It can range anywhere from 6.5% of costs all the way up to 90% of costs. A district's transportation aid ratio is determined by the population of the district, the wealth of the district, the number of students in the district, and other factors. So what happens is a district, let's say they spend $100 in transportation costs, their transportation aid ratio is 60%, then that district will receive $60 from the State Education Department to help offset those costs of transportation. Transportation costs are included in the State Aid Management System, referred to as SAMS, in Form ST3. One thing I want to point out is it's typically the district in which the student is enrolled in school that is responsible for providing the transportation. So again, the district in which the child is enrolled in school, regardless of where they're living, district where they are enrolled in school that's responsible for the transportation. There are some exceptions to that. For example, if the Department of Social Services places the child in temporary housing outside of the district, Department of Social Services may be responsible for that transportation. If you ever have questions about who's responsible for transportation in a particular case, definitely feel free to give us a call. Another thing, too, to point out is that districts can be creative as to how they provide transportation. They can contract with other districts. They can also provide mileage to parents who are able to, who have access to a car and are able to transport their child. Oftentimes that's a very cost-effective way to provide transportation, and that expense is aidable. So again, providing mileage reimbursement for a parent is aidable for a district. In addition to state aid, there are also three other funding sources for transportation that I want to mention. For students who are in a runaway and homeless youth shelter, the state education department will reimburse either the shelter or the school district, whichever entity is providing the transportation, for a student who is in one of those runaway and homeless youth or RHY shelters, if that shelter is located outside of the school district boundaries. In addition, there are approximately 57 school districts and BOCES that receive McKinney-Vento subgrants. Those districts can use subgrant funding to pay for to help offset the cost of transportation. If you have a question as to whether or not your district receives McKinney-Vento funds, please go to our website, and under info by topic, you can scroll down to McKinney-Vento grant for more information. And then finally, Title I funding, as of July 1st, can now be used to cover transportation expenses. Recently, the U.S. Congress passed an appropriations bill that now allows Title I funding, again as of July 1st, to be used to cover the cost of transportation for a student who is homeless without running afoul of the supplement, not supplant provisions of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So this change allows districts much more flexibility in how they use that Title I funding for kids in temporary housing. Also, too, that RHY reimbursement that I mentioned before, the reimbursement form is included in the materials for you to download. Okay, we have another poll for you, true, false question here. Transportation expenses for students who are homeless are reimbursed through the STAC process, true or false? And just about half of you voted. Give it a few more seconds here. Okay, most of you have voted, and most of you got that one right, which is great. The answer to that is false. So the STAC process only pertains to state aid for instruction. The process for getting reimbursed for transportation expenses is totally separate from the STAC process. They're two separate processes. STAC process is only for instructional aid, and then the transportation expenses, you want to make sure that you include those with all of your other district expenses, which are then included on the ST3. Okay, so again, SCD will reimburse a district for the cost of instruction for a McKinney-Vento student who is last permanently housed in a different New York State district. And SCD typically reimburses districts typically 60% of their approved transportation costs, including those for McKinney-Vento students. Okay, so now we're going to take a short break here for questions.
Hi, Jen. We had a couple questions come in. Going to just talk about the transportation that we just went over. Will a school district receive reimbursement if the transportation that is provided is either public transportation, so like the cost of public transportation, or a taxi?
It has to be an approved expense, so it depends what type of taxi service. I know public transportation expenses are aidable. A taxi service, I believe it depends on what type of taxi service the district is using. Again, there's a number at the end of the presentation for the transportation office and for transportation aid questions, and they would be able to talk through exactly what type of taxi expense might be aidable.
Great. Let's see. Who needs to be notified when a student is placed in permanent housing?
So when a student is placed in permanent housing on the STAC form, there is a box. So if a parent tells you we are moving into permanent housing later this month, and then the parent confirms they've moved, the liaison would take that completed STAC form that they have for the student, fill in the box the date that they moved into permanent housing. If there is an open STAC with state ed, then the district would need to send a copy of the STAC form with the date moved into permanent housing completed up to the STAC office so that they can then close out that STAC for that student.
All right, and those are the only questions for now.
Great. Okay, I want to touch on Title I, in particular the Title I set-aside. So if a district has non-participating Title I schools, it must set aside a portion of its Title I funds specifically to serve students in temporary housing. So most districts that receive Title I funding don't allocate their funding to all of their schools. They tend to designate certain schools as Title I funds and concentrate the funding there. So if your district has non-participating, if your district receives Title I funding and has non-participating schools, it must do this set aside for students in temporary housing. If you have a question as to how much your district is setting aside or receiving in Title I funds, there is a link there on the bottom of the screen that shows you where you can look up your district's amount. The set-aside can be used for students who are in a Title I school or a non-Title I school and can be used for a variety of different services, including, for example, per diem counseling or per diem tutoring, basic and emergency supplies, for example, personal hygiene items or school notebook. It can pay for parental involvement programming, intervention programs, as I mentioned before, transportation, outreach efforts to help identify students in temporary housing, the salary or part of the salary of the liaison. These are all examples of ways in which Title I funding can be used to help students in temporary housing. So how is the set-aside determined? Well, there's no allocation method. Districts have broad discretion as to how they determine what the set-aside should be. Here are 4 different methods that a district could use in determining the set-aside. It could do a needs assessment involved to determine the costs involved with serving students in temporary housing and then fund accordingly. It could multiply the number of students in temporary housing by the district's Title I per pupil allocation. It could set aside, if your district receives a McKinney-Vento subgrant, it could set aside a portion of Title I funds matching that subgrant amount. Or it could come up with a percentage amount based on the district's poverty level or the district's Title I allocation. So those are all ideas that districts could use in determining what the set-aside amount should be. So again, the set-aside funds can be used in many different ways to support students in temporary housing. Okay, it's time for our post-test here. Again, these are 4 short true and false questions. It'd be great if you could just take a minute here to check them off. All answers are anonymous. Okay, just about half of you have finished it. We'll give folks about 10 more seconds here. Okay, great. And now I'll share the answers in just a second here. So the first question, a student who is homeless must transfer to the district in which the student is temporarily residing. All of you got that right. The answer to that is correct. In fact, it's typically in the student's best interest to maintain enrollment in the district of origin. Number 2, the STAC 202 form should be completed and sent to the State Education Department for any student identified as homeless. The answer to that is false, and most of you got that right. Again, you're only sending it to the State Education Department if the student was last permanently housed in a different New York State district. Number 3, in most cases, a district can get reimbursed for the cost of instruction for a student in temporary housing if it is not the district of origin. That is correct. That's true. And then number 4, districts cannot get reimbursed for transporting McKinney-Vento students. And the answer to that is false. They can get reimbursed using the same process that districts use for reimbursement for transportation costs associated with kids in permanent housing. So I want to share a couple more resources with you, and then we'll open it up to questions. So again, I want to mention that we have posters and brochures that you can order free of cost from us. We'd be happy to send them out to you, as well as our hotline for any questions you may have. Folks frequently call us with eligibility questions with particular scenarios that they just want a sounding board for, because we know that these types of situations can get very complex and difficult for school districts to tease out what's going on. Also, here are some phone numbers that I'm sure most of you already have, but wanted to include just in case. The STAC office number, they can answer any question you have about instructional aid and tuition reimbursement. The state aid office for transportation, and they can talk you through which expenses are allowable, and how the transportation aid reimbursement process works. SED's information and reporting services for those questions related to how to report in your student management system on students in temporary housing. So you have to, in your student management system, you have to include which students are identified as homeless, what their temporary living situation is, whether or not they're an unaccompanied youth, and whether or not they receive McKinney-Vento grant-funded services. So those are the 4 things that districts have to report on related to homeless ed. And then finally, the phone number for Melanie Faby, the Program Associate for Homeless Ed at the State Education Department. For those of you who don't know her, she is just wonderful. And it has a wealth of information, and if she can't get you the answer, she will get you to someone who does have the answer. So now in our remaining minutes, I want to open it up to questions from the group.
All right. Well, we just had one question come in. When determining in the STAC process, how does SED determine what is deducted from the district of origin?
Okay, so the way they do that is they look at what the basic contribution amount is, and the basic contribution amount is the per pupil tax levy. So whatever the school district is receiving in local tax dollars from the local property taxes that the school district is getting, divided by the total enrollment, is the basic contribution amount, is the per pupil basic contribution amount. So what the State Education Department does is it will deduct the per pupil basic contribution amount for the number of kids in temporary housing from that district who are being educated by other districts where they're temporarily residing, and then they prorate that amount based on how long that student is being educated by another district. It's a confusing process. It's not straightforward because what the district of current location is receiving is different from what the state education department is recouping from the district of origin. So it's not a straight flow of funding. Again, district of current location is fully reimbursed at whatever the non-resident tuition rate is, and state ed is recouping the per pupil tax levy prorated for the period of instruction for that student.
All right. If we want to go over, I guess, a situational question, earlier in the webinar someone asked, would moving in with a boyfriend be considered sharing the housing of others?
It could be. It could be. Those types of eligibility determinations very much depend on the unique circumstances of the student. I can't stress enough how much districts really need to look at each individual case separately and analyze the circumstances in each one in making those eligibility determinations. So, for example, if you have a case where a child has either been thrown out of their home or has run away from home because of, for example, significant family dysfunction at home and is temporarily staying with a friend, such as a boyfriend, that could very well be a McKinney-Vento situation in which the child would be covered as homeless under the law. But again, if you have a particular case in mind, definitely give me a call on this slide. This next slide has my contact information, including my direct dial and email. Definitely feel free to give me a call, shoot me an email. If I'm not available, you can definitely feel free to give our hotline a call, and we can talk through the individual case with you to help you make that eligibility determination.
All right, I haven't had any other questions come in at this point.
Okay, well, we are 3 minutes early. I hope this means that we answered all of your questions along the way today. We thank you all for your attention. Again, if you have any questions that come up after we hang up here, definitely give me a call or shoot me an email, and we'd be happy to help. We hope you all have a great rest of the afternoon. Thank you.